before we begin with the proceedings, I thought it is, it is only appropriate that we spend a minute to pay our tributes or homage to Professor Amya Kumar Bagchi, who passed away last evening. Professor Bagchi was one of India's most distinguished economic historians and public intellectuals. His work has been instrumental in helping us young scholars understand the economic and political processes responsible for perpetuating underdevelopment in countries such as India in the erstwhile colonies. Professor Bagchi was a longtime friend of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. He addressed the plenary session of our 10th anniversary conference in 2014. He attended and participated in many of our online meetings and made some valuable contributions to our journal, the Review of Agrarian Studies. We send our deepest condolences to his loved ones, to his daughters, Professor Tista Bagchi and Professor Barnita Bagchi, and to the other members of the family. With these words, let me now call upon the coordinator for this seminar series, Dr. Tapas Singh Modak, to take over the proceedings. Tapas?
Hi. Thank you, Sandeepan. Good afternoon, all. I am Tapas, Associate Fellow at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. And on behalf of the Foundation, let me welcome you all to this third round FAS Young Scholar Online Seminar Series. Although I think that this introduction is no longer required, you all know that this platform is for us, the young scholars, who are working on the agrarian studies and socioeconomic condition of rural population. Through our regular interaction, I believe that we have built a larger research community of young scholars, and we're also trying to explore for future kind of a collaboration on to proceed some kind of research work. This round, 8 scholars drawing from their doctoral research are presenting on various aspects of Indian rural economy. That includes agrarian and labor relation, agrarian histories, environmental policy and governance, and the role of women's work in rural India. And I must highlight that in addition to this diverse topic, the presentations cover findings from across Indian studies. You may be aware that it started with Ritika's work on rural transformation in Assam, then Achal's interesting work on apple cultivation in Himachal Pradesh. And in the last seminar, we discussed an interesting presentation by Tony Kurinen on the future markets in Kerala. All these past presentations are uploaded in our FAS YouTube channel. If anyone missed this presentation, I argue, kindly please listen to this. It's a very interesting discussion, presentation, and followed by interesting discussion. Following this, we'll be covering in the next seminars, including today's one, the research findings from Haryana, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and Madhya Pradesh. So I must say, this series covers such quite diverse kind of a research area. Now, I must express my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Barbara Harris White, Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at the University of Oxford, who served as a chair of our seminar series. Her continuous support to us is vital for the success of this platform. Her detailed comments for each seminar, feedbacks, comments, and also the important insight from her long-standing research on Indian rural economy are invaluable to us as a young scholar. Thank you, Professor Barbara, for everything. I also want to express my thanks to Rosa Luxembourg Stiftung, South Asia, for their ongoing support in facilitating the seminar series. Now, let me introduce our speaker today for the 4th seminar of this series, Dr. Prachi Bansal. She will be presenting an important topic in the context of diversification of Indian rural economy. The title of her presentation is Labor Absorption in Crop Cultivation in Rural Haryana. Today, Dr. Niladri Sekhar Dhar, Associate Professor at Bihar Institute of Public Finance and Policy, a long-standing research collaborator of FAS, will be the discussant for this seminar. And I must say this topic of today's seminar is very special to us. In the last 2 decades, through the lens of village studies, FAS has been taking many efforts to understand the condition of wage work in the countryside. including the changing labor relation, labor use in the agriculture. In fact, Dr. Niladri led many such efforts in different parts of the country. Recently, one such important work is estimation of surplus labor in crop production across 20 villages located in different parts of the country. You can access this full report from our FAS website, and also a research article is also published in our journal, Review of Agrarian Studies. Now, without further delay, I would like to invite Professor Barbara to initiate and moderate the proceeding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tapas. Can everybody hear me?
Yes,
Welcome
Professor.
to
Yes.
this seminar, not from the University of Oxford, but from the University of Turin, where there is a group of us involved in a Gramscian analysis of the rural employment scheme. And my comrades in Turin wish to join me in saluting the life and the work of Professor Bagchi. Thank you very much, Sandeepan, for your celebration of it. Tapas has explained the background of the subject matter of this seminar. So before we actually start, all I need to say are the rules of the game, which are that Prachi will speak for up to 30 minutes, that Niladri will reply for up to 10 minutes, and after that, the floor will be open to Q&A from the chat, which I will attempt to classify and moderate. Okay, so without more ado, over to you, Prachi. We're all eager to hear.
Thank you.
About labor use in Haryana agriculture.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Barbara, and thank you, FAS, for giving me this opportunity. I'll just share my screen so that we get the presentation right away. Okay. So the topic of my presentation is labor absorption in rural Haryana. Just to briefly start, labor absorption basically refers to employment in agriculture, but measured per unit of land area, such as per hectare or per acre. And in case of India, the situation is that we have a lot more workers available, but we are constrained by the amount of land. So total employment created in agriculture is actually constrained by the amount of land available, not so much by the amount of workers available. So looking at labor absorption in this context seems very important. We have multiple statistics of labor employment from our periodic labor force surveys, etc. But the statistics for labor absorption are very few and limited. Now, earlier, this topic was studied in basically three contexts. First was looking at the whole Lewisian framework and how structural transformation moving away from agriculture and to industry, and how maybe labor absorption in agriculture was important for poverty alleviation of some low developing economies, and to identify economic, how economic growth can happen. And this study during the 1970s was led by a lot of organizations as well. So, for example, ILO did a series of articles called the RTEP series, in which a lot of this kind of labor absorption worked. And from Japan, Professor Ishikawa and many others participated and led foundation for this work. Professor Krishna Bhardwaj from JNU was one of the people in India who did this work in a very initial period. The second reason why this is mostly studied is to talk about during the mode of production debate in the 1970s, that what was happening to the composition of labor in terms of hired labor and production and family labor. So here also the composition of labor force became a very important variable, and therefore labor absorption was studied primarily using something called the farm management studies data that was available during that time. And the most studied aspect of labor absorption was the use of how modern technology impacted labor use. So, for example, what happened when tractors came, or what happened when combine harvesters came, to overall labor absorption in agriculture, displacement, etc. But now the context has changed a lot, and the question arises that why should we study labor absorption now? To very briefly summarize, first is that right now Indian agriculture is going through a distress period. You have high inequality of land ownership. You have declining employment in agriculture, increasing cost. There is also very limited land reforms. There's high inequality in land ownership. Also, overall levels of unemployment are very high. There's an ongoing debate about what is happening to women's work in India, and there is existence of I'll explain this further in the presentation, but existence of the unfree labor relations in agriculture even now. And just to give a context of why is it important to study it now, is that most of the scholars have studied labor absorption with respect to only average labor use for a few crops. So we have data available from cost of cultivation data, which is for the Ministry of Agriculture, which most of the people have utilized for looking only at average labor use. And so we don't get to see what is happening to the variations within a crop, like across size class of farmers or between men and women, etc. There are very rich primary studies that do exist which have tracked labor absorption, but they are very limited and not very recent in terms of and in particular studies on Haryana are very limited. So what this study tries to do is to look at what has happened in which crops there is labor, what is the kind of labor use, in what particular task, who is doing the work, men, women, children, where is the work happening, and what is the kind of labor that is used, hired, family labor, what kind of contracts, whether it is piece rated, daily wage, casual, long-term, unfree, etc. And before I get in deeply into my study on Haryana, I just want to give you a broad picture to contextualize what is the situation of labor absorption using the aggregate data. So overall, labor absorption has declined in most crops. It has declined in paddy, wheat, maize, etc. In most crops, it has declined, but the decline has been very high in wheat, and cotton has been one crop in which there was a time period, there was an increase in the labor absorption for some time. And this coincided with the use of BT cotton in some areas. As the BT cotton was introduced, there was an increase. In terms of, if I speak about which are the high labor using crops, and this labor is measured in terms of hours per acre of net sown area. So sugarcane 472 basically means 472 hours per acre of labor is used per acre of the net zone area. And as you can see, sugarcane is one of the most labor using crops. In terms of cereal crops, paddy is the most labor using crops. And the general trend is, the all India trend is that there has been a decline in labor absorption in most crops. But of course, there are variations across crops. With this background, I would now like to get into my study in Haryana. The study in Haryana was primarily done in these three regions, Fatehabad, Sonipat, and Bhiwani. And it was part of a primary study of agrarian relations, a project that was conducted by the Society for Social and Economic Research in 2018-19. Chose 4 villages for the study, and all these 4 villages have been studied in the past. So 2 of the villages were studied during 1920s. One village was studied in 2003, and one of them was one was in 1920s, 2 were in 1950s, and 1 was studied in 2003. And to briefly tell you about how the sampling happened. So in all these villages, we collected the ASHA workers survey registers. So ASHA workers are the accredited workers who work in as part of the National Rural Health Mission, and they maintain a survey of each and every household in the village. So we collected their registers, and using that as a list, there was information on social group. So using that as a list, we did a stratification based random stratified sampling to get a total of 293 households. The landlords in the village were purposely selected. And there were certain households which were living in a particular village called Bidhana. They were living outside the main settlement. So for those households who were living outside the main settlement and which were not covered by the Asha workers survey, we did a random sampling using the latitude and longitude data. Now coming to very briefly talking about what my villages were. So two villages, Khandrai and Cheherkala, both these villages were studied in the 1950s by the agro-economic research centers. Khandrai was located in Sonipat area. The main dominant caste here were Jats, and the village was tube well irrigated. Paddy, cotton, bajra, jowar, and sugarcane was also grown in this village. Wheat paddy, as you'll see, is grown in mostly all the villages. Cheherkala was located in Bhiwani, which was in a drier area. So this area was not fit for cultivation of paddy. So Cheherkala had no cultivation of paddy. We had wheat, gram, bajra, and cotton, jowar, etc. Yields were very low. This was a very dry kind of village, and because it was dry, having a tube well was a very important determinant of the class position for residents of this village. The next two villages, Jamalpur, Shekhar, and Bidhana, both were located in Fatehabad. Jamalpur, Shekhar, I would say, of the four villages that I surveyed, was the most modern or progressive, you can say, was in terms of, I would not say progressive, but modern village. It was located in Tohana, and it had a lot of irrigation facilities. Tube well irrigation was there. There were 3 canals, and wheat, paddy, cotton, vegetables were the main areas. And it was also a very caste diverse village. So amongst the upper caste, it was not only the Jats, but it was also Punjabi Hindus, non-Punjabi Hindus, Sikhs, and a few Muslim households that were there. But very high levels of inequality in terms of land ownership. So 68% of the households in this village were landless. In contrast, Bidhana was again in Fatehabad, and this village had wheat, paddy, cotton, and vegetables are the main crops. Again, upper caste were Jat Sikhs, and Dalits were Chamar, Rai Sikhs, Mazhabi Sikhs, and Dhanaks. The Chamars and Dhanaks were the major caste groups within Dalits in all the 4 villages. And in Bidhana, there were a lot of large landowners or immigrants who came from Pakistan called the Mehtas, Aroras, and Punjabis, who were allotted land during after the partition, and they mostly live in the towns, but they have still their lands being operated in Bidhana. Now, I want to very briefly talk about how I did the classification of the socioeconomic classification for these households, although this in itself is a sort of a longer topic, so I'm not going very deeply into this. But so in case of Haryana, the classification of households is a complex task because of multiple reasons. One was that the non-farm work formed a significant part of the employment and income of people. Secondly, livestock was something in which a lot of families were engaged. So a lot of labor time, especially of the women, was going in the livestock work. And because of a very high penetration of machinery, the mechanization was so high in all the 4 villages that labor time in agriculture was very low. So these were some of the complexities that were there in these 4 villages. And given that, what I have done is that I've taken 2 major criterions. These are labor time deployed and income in various tasks. And these labor time deployed and income, so income is being calculated from all the 6 sources that you see here. That is incomes from crop, income from casual work, income from work in non-farms, jobs, remittances, pensions, self-employment in various occupations. And then once this is and then labor time also is calculated for the work that is done in agriculture in both crop cultivation as well as in livestock keeping. The first set of households that were classified were the non-agriculture households, for which the criteria was very simple, that if the time that is deployed in agriculture and the income is the time that is employed in non-agriculture and the income that is deployed in non-agriculture is higher than the farm occupations, then these are clearly non-agriculture households. And it was easy to identify the kind of businesses, and even within businesses there was a range. So there were businesses which were hiring hiring workers from outside, but there were businesses which were operating just on their family labor. And then of course the manual worker households which were there. After that, to classify the cultivator households, firstly the landlords were identified, and then within the cultivator households, the households where the income and time in farm occupations was higher than income and time from non-farm occupations is a clear case of cultivator households. But there were also households, because as I said, of heavy machinery use, that their income from farms were higher, but the time that they devoted in agriculture was not so high. Because my study is primarily focused on labor absorption, I have categorized these households as cultivator households. And from within these cultivator households, I use the criteria of labor ratio defined as follows, that the number of days of labor hired in by the household for crop production and livestock keeping divided by the number of days that goes used by family labor and in the laboring out. And using labor ratio and the scale of cultivation that is measured by the gross value of output and ownership of land, I further divided these households into poor peasants, middle peasants, and small landlords, rich and capitalist farmers. I'm sorry that I'm not going very much into the detail of this, because then I will not be able to cover the results from labor absorption. But maybe this is a topic that can be taken up in questions or follow up. So this is the final classification that I get in terms of the different kinds of households. And as you can see, the landlords, small landlords, middle peasants, poor peasants, and there is a category of long-term agriculture labor. These constitute about 35% of my households. And the rest, 65%, are actually primarily non-agriculture households. Within non-agriculture, I had to divide this into self-employed own account and self-employed establishments, because the variety of businesses in Haryana was overwhelming. There were petrol pump owners, and then there were very petty vendors who were self-employed. It was this categorization was therefore kept in mind so that I can divide these two kind of businesses, which were own account and establishment. Own account being those who just use family labor, establishment who has at least hired labor. Coming to the major topics of the study's result. So overall, the result that I got was that there's 36 days of work per acre of net sown area in the entire year. Now, this is an abysmally small number, and an important point to add to the significance of this number is that the cost of cultivation data that we have from Ministry of Agriculture gives you the labor absorption per crop. So it does not give you an aggregate statistic that, okay, this is how many days of work goes in agriculture in the entire year. It only tells you this much is what goes in paddy, this much of it is what goes in wheat, etc. So field study can actually provide this kind of estimate. And this, as you can see, is a very small number, that only 36 days of work per acre of net sown area is available. This is for all villages. And to make the distinction clear, I have given here a table which shows what is the average labor hours in cultivation of these crops in my villages versus the average hours that is calculated by the cost of cultivation data. As you can see, there is of course some differences, and I'll explain the differences. So for example, if you look at wheat, My average labor hours is 68.6, and for CCPC it's 98. The differences is also due to the fact that in Haryana, it varied a lot between different villages. So some villages where there was manual harvesting, the use of labor was higher. But in villages where there was high use of combined harvesting, of course, the labor hours were less. So these numbers are, although not so for example, paddy, it's very similar, and if you take the sum of paddy wheat, which is the general trend in most of these villages, then it almost matches up to the CCPC numbers. For sorry, yes. So for some of these crops, my estimates are much higher than the estimates of CCPC. And the reason, for example, sugarcane, my estimate is 587, whereas CCPC's estimate for all India was only 429. The reasons for this is again the same, that because when you do the survey yourself, there are certain kind of procedures which CCPC, for example, does not take and has been criticized in the past. One such thing is post-harvest operations. So they are not very well accounted for in that data, which I think are better accounted here. And therefore, there is this discrepancy. But nevertheless, the overall levels of labor hours are extremely low. And as you can see, they vary. Cotton, sugarcane, paddy are high labor using crops. Fodder crops are also high labor using crops, but other crops are mostly very low labor using, and wheat is extremely low labor using. Now, okay, another point is that if you look at the labor used by class, this labor absorption shows that across classes, the total labor use is extremely same. It's varying between 34 to 36, 38. But to make the point clear that why did I do the class analysis for this, the labor absorption, is because class is actually very important when you look at the total generation of employment in agriculture. So all the higher class positions were associated with higher level of generation of employment, and the implications of their class position was of this low levels of labor use for different classes were very different. So for instance, the class of poor peasants basically found work in precarious non-farm employment. But the small landlords, rich landlords, or the middle peasants, they found work in non-employment in those establishments or own account or government salary jobs or businesses. There's a class of CRE workers, which I have written over here. CRE refers to long-term labor, and I'll substantiate the CRE work in a minute. The other point I want to talk about the class is that between the rich peasants and the poor peasants, the differences in labor productivity were almost, they were twice as productive. The rich peasants were twice as productive than the poor peasants. And coming to the aspects of gender, female labor absorption was extremely low. Out of the 36 days of work, women only got 13 days of work. And use of family labor, the women was extremely low. So the major tasks that women were doing were actually very marginal kind of tasks. They were either doing cotton picking, which was considered very low remunerative for the men, or they were engaged in paddy transplanting, or in the daily fodder cutting kind of task, the major task that women were employed. But even amongst the family labor, men were extremely engaged in agriculture work compared to women. And that is also sort of because there was so much of mechanization that very few tasks were required manual labor. And those which were very arduous were mostly done by women. And other kind of tasks. So for example, spraying urea or spraying pesticide, these were not the tasks that women were doing. These were tasks majority men were doing. Operating heavy machinery was again tasks that men were engaged in. And most of the work was hired, so almost 72% of female workers and 66% of male workers were hired on piece-rated tasks. And piece-rated task, not just, so earlier piece-rated tasks, we used to think only of harvesting of paddy or paddy transplanting, but in these villages, even spraying fertilizers, spraying pesticides, etc., or laying out pipes or loading, unloading of bags of produce was also made into organized through piece-rated terms. And women were engaged in these piece-rated tasks, but that total overall absorption were very low. So as I said, paddy transplanting and cotton picking were the main tasks that women were engaged in. And the mechanization of this threshing, weeding, harvesting operations for the two major crops, paddy and wheat, meant that there was very low employment in these operations. So I would just like to show you this. What is the levels of labor use per operation? Now, this is something again which the cost of cultivation data collects but never releases. So we do not know in each what is the particular operation in which we have what kind of labor absorption. And as you can see, within wheat, which is the lowest labor absorbing crop, it has men operating 55 hours, whereas women getting only 10 hours of work. And women's work, as you can see, is only harvest and post-harvest operations. That too in villages where basically combined harvester is not used a lot, or in places where the loading, unloading work happens through using women worker, which is very few. It's basically manual harvesting of wheat where women are getting a little bit of work. That was only in case of the Cheherkala village, which was relatively backward village of the four. And otherwise, it's mostly men who got work here. To contrast the situation, I have put a table for cotton, which was a high labor using crop. Now, if you look at cotton, women get a good amount of work, 145 hours per acre of work. But most of the work that women are getting is again in harvest, which is cotton picking, which is again something which is not considered as a very remunerative option for men. And then weeding, which is 28 hours of work. So it's not all the operations that women get work in. So I have not presented here all the numbers, but when I looked at both sides, the absorption and the employment in agriculture and non-agriculture for women, what we found is that the PLFS data shows you that 15% of women were employed in the working age group in rural Haryana in 2017-18. And I've chosen 2017-18 because that was the year for which data were collected. Whereas I got the number 49%, which is also what most studies by Swaminathan and many other studies have shown, that when we capture these data through our own surveys, women's work is captured better. So that was one of the reasons that here we found that 49% of the women in study villages were employed, which is still a small number. But overall, if we looked at what has happened, there has been a significant defeminization of women in agriculture. And if somebody asks a question of what are women doing in Haryana, most of the women that we looked at were actually engaged in livestock maintenance. So that was the major task of women. They got very little, virtually zero non-agriculture employment, very few avenues of non-agriculture employment, very few salaried jobs. And agriculture employment, though it was there, it was not very neither very remunerative nor very much. It's very limited. The next thing that I want to point out is that in my study, I found these workers called Siri or Muzara. These were about 10% of my sample households, so about 30 households. And these are basically unfree workers. So unfreedom refers to work which is done under some form of coercion and without payment at a regular wage. And basically, if I have to very simply put it, it's using Professor Ramachandran's studies, that there is workers at a scale. This unfreedom is at a scale where at the one end you have a bonded labor, and one end there is a free worker, and there's a continuum of unfree workers. So CD workers were those kind of unfree workers. They had no standard terms of contract. They worked for a share of the produce, and this share of the produce can vary from 1/12 to 1/4. They almost had to bear the cost of material inputs. But just to briefly tell you, they are not tenants, so they have no say in what to grow. They can't take any decision, and they are basically indebted. They are given loan in the beginning, and they are expected to work for the landlord until they have repaid the loan. So in the previous studies also, so as I said that these 4 villages were studied previously by different organizations. In 4 of the 3 villages, I found the prevalence of these CD workers. These are, of course, located in different agroclimatic zones of Haryana. And earlier studies have looked at Western Haryana as the main place where you find CD workers, but that was not the case here. I found them in Sonipat, I found them in Bhiwani. And overall, their processes of work has also changed. Here, earlier, if I were to look at, let me just skip here. Earlier also, series belonged to the Dalit class. Now also they belong to the Dalit class. They rely very heavily on the unpaid labor of their women workers in their family. And contracts earlier were usually standard. So earlier they were usually getting 1/4 share of the produce. But now they, in our survey, we found they were getting somewhere between 1/12 to 1/4. Also, the coercion has changed. So they are not the same kind of coercion that you expect from the landlord, which was happening earlier, but they're still engaged in labor services, that they still had to do certain tasks for the landlord for free. I think I'll just skip to the conclusion, and we can come to some of this, how things have changed in terms of earlier and now. But to broadly conclude, so agrarian relations in Haryana, as I found, were fettered with inequality and precarious employment. There was still persistence of unfreedom. So there was still these components which you call as feudal, in terms of existence of khap panchayats and unfree workers, CD workers, and the caste-class inequalities. The gendered implications of low levels of labor absorption are far too many, because women's main area of work earlier used to be agriculture, but now with this heavy mechanization and the penetration across all classes, women's work has shrinked a lot. There is very high dependence of the households on non-farm occupations and various kinds of non-farm occupations. You had drivers here who had their own cars. You had drivers who worked on piece rate. You had drivers who worked as private employees. So there are all kinds of non-farm occupations and multiple kinds of non-farm occupations by one single person throughout the year. So, and of course, significant defeminization of work in crop cultivation. So I'll stop the presentation here.
Thank you very much, Prachi. I know you haven't finished, but you've given us a great cornucopia of information and ideas within 30 minutes, so thank you. And now I would like to call on Niladri Sekhar to give his discussant's comments. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Barbara, and thank you. I just switch off my video so that I don't lag behind. So, and thank you, Prachi, for this very interesting presentation. And let me just first get the important takeaways for me from this presentation, which are that of course, from all 4 villages shows that labor absorption in crop production was low. And second one is, I'll elaborate on these points. Second one, your argument on defeminization, and third one is the change in the labor contract, or which labor contract that is from daily wages to piece rate rated wages. And fourth one, as you already mentioned, and that is not the the main component of this presentation, that is class, but I'll make some points about this. Okay, the first point is that as you showed that for almost for all the villages, the labor absorption in crop production was low. And see, this is the pattern we are also observing. The villages we have studied under the project on agrarian relations in India. So there we found that the overall the labor absorption capacity was low, given a large supply of labor force prevailed in the villages. For few villages where we have time series data, we have seen that in case of Anantavaram in Andhra Pradesh, where we have seen that from mid 70s to early 2000, and recently a study done by Shoham, we have seen that the labor absorption in rice cultivation, which is a rice producing belt, so has been declining. However, the labor absorption depends on various factors. There's determined by various factors like scale of operation, farm size, then diversity in cropping pattern that you have mentioned, intensity of input uses, and access to means of production. To understand what are the reasons of low labor absorption, it's always better to get a full picture of all these aspects, like what is the farm sizes, average farm sizes in the village, what kind of cropping cycles they follow. In your case, most of the villages, it's paddy, rice, and wheat. In some cases, I think cotton and wheat. So it's always better to, and also the access to the means of production, which is important. Machine labor is one important factor in this. Okay, the second point I would, that's very interesting for me, that is defeminization of agriculture is taking place. And you have, see, I'm a bit confused with this, whether there is a defeminization agriculture or, because of women are going out from agriculture, or there is any other pattern, any other tendencies are taking place. Okay. But I think it needs to require further exploration, that why this this depeasantization is happening. But I also think that to understand feminization, you need at the village level, at the primary data level, you need data for for at least 2 periods. Okay, I think I'm not sure, but I think for one village you have recent data, that is Bidhana, right? So
Yes.
Yeah, I think it requires further exploration, that why there's a huge fall in the proportion of women workers in agriculture. Third point is dominance of piece rates in, as you said, that piece rates are dominant labor contract in the villages, and you also mentioned that the piece rates are prevailing mostly in the female-dominated tasks, like rice transplanting, harvesting, cotton weeding, and picking. So my question is that what are the implications of this piece rated operations on the gender composition of labor and the wage earnings of the workers, and most importantly, what is happening to the length of the working day? means, how different is the length of the working day between the, the daily rated work and the piece rated work. And these are my 3 major points which I wanted to make. About your class thing, see, to identify peasantry, the 2 variables you have taken, that is labor ratio and the level of income, I guess. So these two variables are most complicated to understand. For me, labor ratio is complicated variable because now it's very difficult very difficult to differentiate between the manual workers and the peasants who participate in the labor force. So in the rural labor market, you have both. You have workers from manual worker households as well as from the larger section of the peasantry. So for me, because of presence of peasants in the rural labor market, the labor ratio become very complicated, variable to use as identifier, class identifier. Next is about income. Now, income is variable. Income varies, year to year. So because of various exogenous and endogenous variable factors. So income as a variable for a specific year cannot a good indicator of the is sufficient to differentiate the peasantry. And also I wanted to understand another thing, that you have said that there's a huge, almost all post-harvest operations are mechanized in these villages. So what is the gender implication, gender division of labor, has changed due to the mechanization in crop production? Yeah. Thank you for your presentation again. Thank you, Professor Barua, for giving me time.
Thank you, Prachi. That was very interesting, and these 4 villages. And I think I want to echo some of the questions that Niladri raised. But before that, let me say, I think defeminization is not a very good term. Let's be clear, women are stuck in rural India and in agriculture and livestock and all that. So, but that's the minor point. I think the bigger point is that you need to put these 4 villages in a bigger context. And I think some of the PARI studies we have done in the Women in Work book and Niladri's work and elsewhere, these patterns vary of family use and hired labor use, and the gender division of that varies quite significantly across regions of India. So I think that would make it a more plausible argument to situate this particular set of findings and see whether it fits into larger patterns that are being observed.
I'm sorry, at the risk of repeating myself, what I invited the audience to do is to put Q&A in the, to put questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. I've already got a list building up in the Q&A. Thank you very much. But what I'd like to do is invite Prachi to spend a very brief time responding to the most important of the very rich comments that we've had so far.
Yes. Thank you, Niladri and Madhura, for these comments. So starting with the very simple ones, I think the length of the working day. So for the piece-rated contracts, the work was organized such that it was 4 or 5 hours in the morning, then there was a break, and then again 4 or 5 hours in the evening. And obviously it was longer than the daily wage contracts. But as you said, as the point that most of the tasks in which women were also involved were now piece rated. I think that was a tendency for almost all kinds of tasks that they were making piece rated. So that included fertilizer spraying, that included loading, unloading work also, in which women were not primarily involved, but those jobs were also made piece rated. Regarding defeminization, what I mean, your point is correct that I do not have data for all the 4 villages previous data. So my understanding about this defeminization is coming from 2 points. One is, of course, the PLFS data, which actually has changed after 2018-19. So that I admit that those trends that it is showing now is much different than the trend on which I analyzed it until 2018-19. And secondly, because women, for even the earlier studies for which I have certain data, women were employed in a lot of at least subsistence level farming in these villages, and they got work as agriculture labor in in villages nearby or in their own village. But in these villages, what we saw is that very limited work as agriculture labor was available to women, and it was mostly women from the Dalit caste who were getting these work. The women who were in the upper caste of these in these villages were not doing any of the work but livestock keeping. So these were some of the things, and maybe the question which was there is yes, I take the point that if I were to look at the whole pari level studies and other studies which have happened, which have looked at labor use data and then put where Haryana stands, we'll get a very good sense of what is happening, because even the secondary data, when I looked at unit level CCPC data, the patterns of labor absorption in Odisha and Bihar are very different from what we observe in Haryana and Punjab. So yeah, I take the point that I have to put these villages in bigger context to make a more informed sort of presentation. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let us turn to the Q&A in the chat. I realize that time is running out on the official hour, but we did start late, and I wonder whether we can overrun. Is that okay?
Yes, Professor Barbara. Yes.
Okay, good. So in the chat, there are 2 complicated questions, multiple questions. One I want to pick up, not in the order in which they were written, is from Shamshir Singh, who is asking a question whether women are paid in kind at all. I mean, this is more or less a yes/no question. Do you ever get peace rate in kind?
No, it was mostly cash wages.
Right.
It was not particularly kind wages. Yes.
And a corollary of that, that's also from Shamshir Singh, is did NREGA have any effect in your villages? And if so, can you tell us very briefly?
It was extremely small. If I were to give an exact number, it was, I think, 5 to 7% of work that, 5 to 7% of workers who got jobs there. Okay, yes, exact number. About 10% of women and 4.2% of men found work in NREGA. And this work was for very few days. There was no household which got a full 100 days of work in my study, and very few days, as in it was only for around 10 to 12 days in a year. So
minimal disruption, as it were, minimal effect on the Hungarian economy.
Yes.
Thank you. I will go on to Vikil's questions, but there's one more from Shamshir, which also seems to come in this order. He asks, how does one measure agriculture and livestock? How do you distinguish it when so many of the activities are interrelated? And I could add to that a question about, with diverse cropping patterns, how do you measure labor per acre?
Yes.
When the land use is, so it's a question about complexity and the practicalities of measurement, or the classification systems used to measure.
Yes. The measurement was a very difficult task. I would tell you that when we were canvassing the questionnaire, because the questionnaire involved data on a lot of things, an average amount of time that it took for us in a household which was a cultivating household was 3 to 3.5 hours to sit with the respondent and get this data. For livestock, what we have done is that I have not collected time use data on livestock, but I have included it in the labor ratio. The way we've done that is that for some of the respondents, the information on how much time for livestock keeping was collected, and it came around to be approximately 2 hours per day, an adult bovine animal. And then we had data on, and this does not include the work that goes in fodder production, because fodder was a crop, so it was, in the labor use of crop, it was calculated. So just for the keepsake of animals, what is giving them water, etc., that total amount was 2 hours of labor per day. And then we had information on how many animals the household had, and based on that, we calculated how much time does livestock keeping takes. But for crop cultivation, a full schedule was sort of canvassed, in which information on each crop, each task, whether you use men, women, children, machine, piece rated, long-term labor, or what kind of labor was used. So it was a full sort of a schedule that was used. And because I think, Barbara, you asked this question to me in the comments that were given earlier. So one of the things was, how do you do it for intercropping or multiple cropping if it is going? So first thing is that in these villages, that was very limited. So something like mustard and wheat being grown together was not seen so much. But if there were cases where this was happening, the labor use was taken together for the two crops. So mustard and wheat, how much time in sowing, how much time in each of the thing. And then it was split by the gross value of output for the two crops. So that was done, but this was, as I would say, it was very limited, because the cropping pattern was very straightforward: paddy, wheat, and in some cases it was sugarcane. So yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Let's go on to Vikal. One thing he's got is about implications for policy, but I want to park that so you can think about the reply.
Yes.
Because I don't think it's obvious. It's a very difficult question. But his other question is about the new era of new technologies in agriculture and what you think the implications for labor are. This is the kind of speculative question that you often get when you give a very meaty seminar. You're asked about the future. I know you didn't research the future, but you now have a lot of knowledge that may be relevant to answering that question.
So can I come into this one?
Please do. Okay. Yes.
So I visited the villages just 1 month before the COVID happened again. And what I saw there, and also was seeing during the survey as well, that there was penetration of some herbicides that was going on. And unfortunately, I do not get many in my sample which were using herbicides. But when I spoke to those households, I got to know that because you use herbicides, the labor that is used in weeding goes down. So that's one. Second is that after COVID, many parts of this Punjab Haryana belt experimented with paddy transplanters. So because they experimented with paddy transplanters, I have not had the opportunity to go back to the villages after that because of work and other things. But I think if paddy transplanters have also come in, then the labor absorption would of course go down. So some of this kind of new technology has this kind of implication. Should I take the policy question, or we have more questions?
We do have more questions.
Yes.
And may I ask one of them?
Yes, yes, please.
Well, may I ask two of them?
Yes,
one I think you've answered already. Jaskaran asks, why is the difference in female labor participation in Haryana so much greater than the All India average? But I think you had a go at answering it. It was to do with the way you measured it. Are there other reasons?
One reason is that India PLFS data captures using the major time criterion. So any work which is below 30 days of work in a year is not captured in the PLFS estimates I mean, not presented in the PLFS estimates that you get for all India, but in the survey, even if you worked for 2 days in a year, you were a worker. So those numbers therefore are, higher. Yes.
Thank you. And before we get to policy, Jaskan also asks, is what you're describing effectively de-peasantization, I might say de-agrarianization, with this loss of absorption of labor in agriculture? What do you think about that conjecture?
That's a big one to answer. Okay. So I would say that these peasants, these households, which I'm calling peasants, self-identified themselves as peasants.
Oh,
So they organize their non-agriculture work around their agriculture calendar. It was not the other way around. So I would not call it de-peasantization, because if there's low levels of labor absorption, because even if there were low levels of labor absorption, it was not low across all crops. There were variations. So, wheat is low, but paddy is higher, cotton is higher. So, I mean, I would not at this stage call it de-peasantization, but of course, this is a question that I need to do more thinking about, perhaps. And yeah, yes.
thank you. I think those are all the questions in the Q&A, and that leaves this horrendous question about what is to be done and how
Okay.
you approach answering that question.
Yes. So this is a question that I've got very commonly in all seminars. And I would think that if you have to increase labor absorption in agriculture, if that is the objective, then one of the important things is public investment in agriculture. Because all cases where public investment in agriculture, especially in irrigation, happens, then the opportunities for people to diverse into crops other than wheat and paddy also happens, and that can lead to higher labor use. Secondly, in regards to the use of unfree workers that is there in these villages, there is of course great policy implications, because these workers are not working under free contracts, and I mean, something needs to be done there to understand why are they not getting the free workers contract. So one of the reasons that these respondents told us was that they find that even though they're in unfree conditions, they have stable work for the year. Whereas in case of non-farm work, it's very precarious. So one major implication of these numbers of labor use is that what are we doing to expand employment in non-farm work? It's very precarious in nature, and people who only have their own endowment can do some kind of business. But people without endowment, which is majority of the wage households, they do not have enough to, get into those kinds of jobs. And I think the labor use numbers. So, okay, so one possible thing that I would like to say is that sometimes when people are asked what are people doing in agriculture, and you get big numbers like 47% of the population is engaged in agriculture, these labor absorption studies actually show that what are the tasks in which people are engaged and how limited and few and gender biased that is. So the alternative that we need in terms of policy is better non-farm employment and better public investment in agriculture if you want to increase labor absorption in agriculture. Yes, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. We're slightly over the limit, but if I may, because there are no other questions, I would like to add, maybe not questions you need to answer now, but things that all of us probably need to think about, and how we study policy at the end of a piece of field research. It's often a residual. We talk about it theoretically, but actually how policy could be altered is a whole topic in its own right. It's not a comment for you, but it's a comment about a lot of work in the series. Something else I want to raise has been raised, but which is labor absorption in different regions, because you've done it by crop and to some extent by class. But I remember Abhijit Sen in about 2003 talking about negative labor elasticities in different regions for different kinds of reasons. So that brings up a third dimension of reaction to your research, which is the role of hypotheses in exploratory research. Again, this is not just for you. It's when we're launching out, how do we structure our research to respond to hypotheses? In your case, you reviewed the literature, but what you didn't, I think, do on the slides was convert the literature to the ideas that were behind your field study. I think that's quite easy to do.
Yes.
But it does raise this general problem. If we're going into the unknown, and so much of this research is going into the unknown, or with very abstract theory behind it, and we go into concrete realities, what are our hypotheses? What was your hypothesis about class and labor absorption? What was your hypothesis about crop and crop combinations and labor absorption, and so on and so forth? Not a personal question, but one for everyone. The other thing is the role of seasonality. We conceive absorption as, I think, I may be wrong, but labor use in days per acre. And absorption for me has a kind of sense of time, that it's a process over time. And that the difference between absorption and labor use might well be to do with time. And if we start thinking about time, we start thinking about seasonality. And that adds a whole new dimension of complexity to those relationships between farm work and non-farm work or unpaid. So I just wanted to throw that in. Yeah, I've got more questions, as you can imagine, but I want to leave it there. But anyway, thank you very much. I don't know if you want to respond now to these more general questions.
Yeah, I think I need to think a little bit about the use versus absorption thing that you just said, because in the literature, it's these words deployment, use, and absorption are used in the similar kind of manner. And now, of course, with time use studies, this dimension of time being the labor use has come up. And so, yes, I think I would rather think about it and probably respond by email.
Okay.
Better.
Okay. But these are general questions to
Yes.
the entire
Yes.
audience, young
Yes.
or less young. Anyway, thank you very much, Prachi, and thank you very much, Niladri, for your terrific discussant comments. And back to the foundation.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor, it will just take a couple of minutes to extend our vote of thanks. Before proceeding, I would like to sincerely apologize for the delay in beginning the seminar. On behalf of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, I extend our heartfelt gratitude to our presenter, Dr. Prachi Bansal, for delivering such an insightful presentation. I trust the discussion was as enriching for her as it was for us in audience. I would also like to express our deep appreciation to our discussant, Dr. Niladri Sekhar Dhar, for moderating the session and adding valuable insights to the discussion. Our sincere thanks goes to Professor Barbara Harris-White for chairing this session and this series. As we all know, her contributions to expanding the scope of this series have been significant. A special mention and thanks to the FAS online team, Sandeepan, Tapas, Utkarsh, and Setu, for their seamless coordination in ensuring the smooth conduct of the seminar. We are also grateful to Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia for their support, which has made this series possible. Last but not the least, our gratitude extends to all our attendees for your active participation, which made this session lively and engaging. The recording of the session will soon be available on YouTube. To learn more about the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and our work, please visit our website at fas.org.in. We are active on social media, and you can find us at FAS Agri Studies on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I request you to follow us on these platforms to stay updated on this seminar series as well as our other initiatives. With this, we conclude today's session. Once again, thank you all for your valuable time and participation.